museum. My name is Julia. I work in the education department here. And we are just wrapped up our past to present lecture series back in February. So now we're trying to begin a monthly lecture series where we have experts coming in and sharing about the history and in this case, geology of Columbia River area. So in this case, we are introducing Dr. Ed Joyce this morning. He has a Ph.D. in Oceanography and B.S. in Geology. His research interests include nearshore sedimentary processes and paleoclimatic studies. Ed has 12 years of college teaching experience and has been on the board of directors of Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition, which is a coastal environmental group, for the past 8 years. So everyone, please welcome Dr. Ed Joyce.
Well, good morning, and thank you for attending my little show here.
Where are you a professor at?
I teach part-time at Clatsop Community College now. I'm retired from industry, but
Oh, okay, thank you.
I just teach part-time. Thanks for attending my little show here. What I plan on doing is giving a broad brush overview of Oregon coastal geology and coastal oceanography, and then we'll move in and have a look at the estuary. So specifically, I want to address coastal tectonics, the geologic controls of what our coastline look like. I'll go into coastal beach dynamics, we'll go into some coastal oceanography, and then we'll move into the estuary. So first, coastal tectonics. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with the concept of plate tectonics, and the theory holds that there are a number of plates that are sliding around on the surface of the earth, and these plates are banging into each other and going under each other, and those arrows that you see are showing the direction of the plate movements, and those little numbers are velocity of plate movement in centimeters per year. So essentially, these plates are sliding around a few inches per year. This is a slide showing the earthquake occurrences, and there is a strong correlation between the occurrence of earthquakes and plate margins. And you shouldn't be surprised. Where the plates are sliding by each other and banging into each other, that's where we have our earthquakes. There are 3 types of plate margins. There is a divergent margin where 2 plates are moving away from each other. Good example of this is a mid-Atlantic ridge. It's a huge feature that goes from the North Pole to the South Pole, goes the whole Atlantic Ocean, and it's huge. At the bottom there's a transform plate margin where 2 plates are sliding next to each other. Classic example of this is the San Andreas Fault. Very good class. And finally, a convergent plate margin. This is what is about 300 miles off our coast, where the Juan de Fuca plate that I'll talk about in a few minutes is being subducted under the North American plate. So we have a convergent plate margin in our neighborhood. Zooming in a little closer here, what I'm showing here is that most people are under the impression that it's the Pacific plate that's being subducted under Oregon. Really, it's the Juan de Fuca plate. The Juan de Fuca plate is a remnant plate, and it's almost gone. It used to be a lot bigger tens of millions of years ago, but this is all that's left of the Juan de Fuca plate, and that's what's being subducted under Oregon. Zooming in a little closer, what's happening here is that the Juan de Fuca plate, like I said, is being subducted, and as it's subducted deeper into the mantle, that crustal material that's being subducted heats up, and it heats up to such an extent that it starts melting, and then it rises up through the crust and comes out as a volcano, and that's how we get the Cascade Mountain Range. So the Cascade Mountains, Mount Hood, Mount Rainier, St. Helens, are all a product of this process of the subduction, heating up of the subducted material, rising up through the crust, and coming out as a volcano. And Mount Hood now good was formed by that process. And that's why the Cascades are essentially a line. Oregon coastal geology is notoriously difficult. And one of the reasons it's notoriously difficult is that tens of millions of years ago, there were microcontinents, small islands off our coast, and as the subduction process occurred, this material was scraped off and accreted onto the Oregon coasts. So on this slide, the island disappears, it was subducted, the plate was subducted, but the material was scraped off and smushed onto the Oregon coast. And eventually, same thing happens to the continent. So you can just imagine what this does to the geology. It's just a real mess. Oh, and by the way, the proper name for this accreted material is an exotic terrain. It's true, that's what they call it. Okay, I want to switch gears here a little bit and get away from geology and talk about coastal ocean processes. First thing I want to talk about is longshore drift. Longshore drift is a process where there's a predominant longshore current, and along with that current, sediments are dragged in that direction. So that whole process of moving sediments along the coast in a predominant direction is called longshore drift. This is a slide of the coast of Maryland, and I want to show here just the effects of longshore drift. Here you see a number of groins that have been built, and you can just look at this and tell the direction of longshore drift. Like direction of longshore drift is from right to left or left to right?
Left to right.
Left to right.
If you said right to left, you're correct. What's happening here is that the sand is piling up on the side that the current is dragging the sand. And I'll have more to say about this in a second, in a few minutes. You can see the effects of longshore drift right in our neighborhood. This is the Columbia River Estuary. Here's Astoria. And I bet you could look at this and tell the direction, the predominant direction of longshore drift. Left to right or right to left? Yeah, left to right, huh? The North Jetty is trapping a lot more sand than the South Jetty, and in fact, Fort Stevens Beach is being eroded dramatically. I walk this beach often, a lot of erosion taking place there, and the reason is all the sand, or a lot of the sand, is being trapped on the Washington side. And there's been 100 meters or so of accretion along here since the jetty was built.
Cheaters.
Yeah. If you walk on the Oregon shore, or you own property along the Oregon coast, beach stabilization is probably an issue. If you walk along the coast, scenes like this are common, where 50 years ago, 75 years ago, people built homes along the coast, and they felt comfortable with the distance that the house was from the coast. Well, after 50, 75, 100 years of erosion, all of a sudden, the situation has changed dramatically. Storms, constant waves battering the cliffs, and now with sea level, these houses are even in more trouble. So, if you live along the coast, or if you're interested, stabilizing the beach might be a concern of yours. And there are 4 major categories of stabilizing your beach. I just want to quickly go through these. There are groins, jetties, breakwaters, and seawalls. You've already seen groins. With a little bit of history, what happened here is that these are pretty exclusive homes, and the first person built their house there, and then somebody else built a house, somebody else built a house, and somebody came up with a great idea of building a groin to make their beach a little bit bigger. Well, their neighbors got the same idea, and what's happened here is that it's obvious. They're losing beach on this side, but gaining beach on that side, and this has been shown over and over again that the net result is that this beach is eroding faster than a beach with no beach stabilization. So it might be contrary to your intuition, but beach stabilization doesn't work. You know, I'll say that again a few different ways. The jetty, we've already seen. So the last slide were groins. Technically, they're called groins. These are jetties. Jetties are typically built to provide protection for the entrance of a harbor or an estuary. Some of you are probably familiar with the story of Bay Ocean.
Yeah.
So back in 1906, this beach used to be way out here somewhere. And what happened is that somebody came up with the idea of building a town here. In fact, once upon a time, it was called the Atlantic City of the West Coast. So people had high hopes for this little community, and for a while, it worked pretty good. Back in 1914, they had a population of 2,000. It was a thriving little community, had a school, kids would walk to school. There was the famous big Oceanography. This had a pool in it with a wave generating machine. It had a theater, had library, restaurants. It was a pretty groovy little place. And what happened was that they built this jetty. And the reason to build the jetty was to keep Tillamook Bay, keep access to Tillamook Bay. Garibaldi's up here somewhere. They built the jetty, and you know the rest of the story. All the sand was trapped to the north. Bay Ocean receded, and finally so the jetty was built in 1913, 1914. In the 30s and 40s, there were a series of storms. The town was destroyed. And in 1956, they abandoned the town. They demolished it. So much for Atlantic City on the West Coast.
So you said pick that up?
I'm sorry?
So you said pick that up?
Yeah.
Technically.
The third type of hard structure I'm going to talk about real quickly here is a breakwater. This is a famous Long Beach, California breakwater, and they constructed it to provide safe harbor for the ships, and it did. It does a good job of keeping storms away from those boats. But you can see that sand built up behind the breakwater, but north and south, it's eroding, and they have to keep dumping sand in there to keep those beaches built up. So once again, not a good example of the effects of a hard structure. And finally, one of my favorites, I grew up not far from Seabright, New Jersey. This is a pretty exclusive community back here, and they wanted to preserve their beach. So they spent about $2 zillion in constructing this huge seawall, and you can see the effects. This is an extreme example. This is during a winter storm. But even during the summer, they only have 20 or 30 feet of beach. And again, the net effect of building this hard structure was that erosion increased, not decreased, because all of these hard structures interrupt the natural flow of sand along the beach. So you screw up what had been going on for thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, and the net effect is faster erosion. So hard structures are not a good thing. So what are some alternatives to these hard structures? There's three major alternatives. Construction restrictions. Oregon has construction restrictions. You no longer can build right on the coast. Relocation, good idea, it costs some money, but it happens. There are houses relocated along the Oregon coast, brought back. And finally, beach replenishment. A couple of years ago, Oregon Shores, the group that I'm with, spoke out against a beach nourishment program along the Oregon coast that was supposed to stop the erosion of land below Route 101 that was being eroded. Okay, so a lot of erosion, and one of the proposed solutions was beach replenishment. Oregon Shores spoke out against this, and good reason. This is a slide from New Jersey again. What it's showing is the process of beach nourishment. So what's going on here, there's a dredge sitting out here, and it's mining the sand off the bottom, it's shooting it in and dumping it on the beach. First of all, it's temporary. Every 4 or 5 years, this beach has to undergo more beach nourishment. It's expensive. It's expensive, it's temporary, and it's an ecologic disaster. The dredgers are smart enough to know where the sand is, and they mine offshore bars. And those offshore bars are natural habitats to all kinds of benthic creatures that now get shot up on the beach. And I have stood and watched this process and seen clams and crabs getting shot up on the beach, and there ain't no way they're going to live. So it's expensive, it's temporary, and it's an ecologic disaster. So, and that's why Oregon Shore spoke out against it occurring on the Oregon coast. Oregon's Goal 18 came about in 1977, and it bans shoreline armoring. Good intention, but people are constantly banging on this door, trying to get around parts of it. And Oregon Shores is constantly fighting it. Okay, let's have a look at some real oceanography here. And no discussion of the Oregon coast would be complete without saying a few words about a tsunami. And if you're not familiar with how a tsunami works, I thought it might be worth talking about. So what's going to happen someday if we ever have our big one? What will happen, it will result from some movement along that fault out there. So where the Juan de Fuca plate is being subducted under the North American plate, there'll be some movement there. That movement, that vertical movement, will cause a movement in the whole water column. The whole water column will be dropped down or raised up significantly, which will cause the tsunami. Now, it's a curious thing, but if you were on a boat out there after the movement on the fault, you wouldn't even see the wave. The wave would be a foot or two high, you wouldn't even notice it, because most of the energy is stored in the water column. What happens is, when that fault occurs, that wave is propagated out in all directions, and the part of the wave that comes to shore starts moving ashore. Eventually, the waveform starts feeling the bottom. That's what this little cartoon is supposed to be showing. So the wave comes in, starts feeling bottom, starts feeling shallow water. It jacks up and slows down and breaks. There was a study a few years ago where we went out and we sampled sediments in Young's Bay, and what we found was evidence. We knew it was going to be there, so no big deal. That we found evidence of the Juan de Fuca earthquake that occurred back in 1700, and what we found was deep marine fossils, tectonic foraminifera, up in Young's Bay. And the only way to get those forams in there was a big wave. And there's other evidence of this around too. Marine debris. I want to say a few words about marine debris. It's a real issue worldwide. It's a real issue. It's a real issue on the Oregon coast too. By far, most of the garbage we find on the beach are plastics. And it's not readily degradable. This stuff is out there for literally hundreds of years. And I'll go into this some more in a few minutes, but the North Pacific is made up of this big gyre. It's called a gyre. And there's something in the middle of it called the Eastern Pacific Garbage Patch. And this is a huge pile of plastics that's just floating around out there. And it's gotten there, and it comes from all over. It comes from Asia as well as the US. And it's there because of this gyre kind of pushes it all to the middle, and then the prevailing westerly winds blows it closer to our coast. There's been very recently, some people have gone out and looked at this garbage patch closely thinking, how can we get rid of this? And what they found is that there's a whole new ecologic community forming around this plastic. There are jellies, there are turtles, there are albatross feeding on these things. They live and breed, they actually live and breed on these rafts of plastic. It's essentially a new marine ecosystem. And a problem is that engineers, oceanographers, or marine engineers are coming up with ideas of how to scoop up this plastic. So they're coming up with all kinds of novel ideas, how to scrape the plastics up, what to do with the plastics. But the problem is, you're going to be killing a lot of marine organisms. Kind of an ethical conundrum here. And I'm not sure what the answer is yet, but it's something that people are working on. And you've probably seen nasty pictures like this, fat animals being fouled by different types of plastics. Most marine birds, when you look at their guts, they contain plastics. A little closer to home, I have been involved in a program called the Marine Debris Survey, Marine Debris Program, that is ran by NOAA. And I've been collecting garbage on Fort Stevens Beach since 2018, me along with some volunteers. And no surprise, 84% of all the junk we found on that beach is plastic. Foam fragments, bottles, bottled beverages, food wrappers, film, rope. Some of the non-plastic stuff is processed wood that's obviously come from construction. What else? Paper, rubber, rope. But again, most of this is plastics. Unfortunately, the plastics is the stuff that's hardest to get rid of. It's around forever. In with all these plastics are these little things called nurdles. Nurdles are tiny granular plastic pellets. They're less than 5 millimeters in size, and they are the building blocks that the plastic industry uses for building all other bigger forms of plastic. So when the big thing breaks down, what's left is the nurdles, and the nurdles are ubiquitous across our beaches and in the guts of animals. Okay, ready for some hardcore oceanography here? Okay, the world's ocean is made up of a series of huge gyres. So every big ocean basin has a gyre, a big circulation of water. In the northern hemisphere, these gyres are clockwise. In the southern hemisphere, they are counterclockwise, largely because of the winds and the Coriolis effect. We all know what the Coriolis effect is. I'm kidding. You have to stay after class to hear about the Coriolis effect. Anyway, so there are these huge gyres, and in the North Atlantic, just as an example, we have the North Equatorial Current that eventually turns into the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream is what makes the East Coast pretty humid. That's a warm current of water. And the Gulf Current goes up into the North Atlantic, and that's why they have palm trees in London at the same latitude as Nova Scotia. It's because there's warm water being dragged across the Atlantic, warming Europe. Similarly, in the Pacific, we have the North Equatorial Current that brings warm water up the coast of Asia. It cools off, it turns into the North Pacific Current, and then it bathes our coast with relatively cool waters, giving us, I think, a lot nicer climate than the muggy climate they have on the East Coast. But that's what keeps our climate mild, is the cool California current bringing cooler temperatures to our coastline. Zooming in a little bit more on the Oregon coast, here's our California current running from north to south. And during the winter, when there is typically a large low pressure system sitting off the Aleutians, we get a lot of southwest winds, southwest currents. a lot of our big storms come from the southwest due to this low pressure off the Aleutians, and what develops is a Davidson current. So again, a seasonal current caused by the big low pressure off of the Aleutians. Everybody's probably heard of upwelling. Upwelling is responsible for the good fisheries that we have. And how upwelling works is that creatures live in the surface waters, they die and they fall to the bottom. That enriches the bottom waters. The bottom waters become nutrient rich. And then the process of upwelling brings those nutrient-rich waters up to our shelves. That's what attracts the fish, and that's what attracts the fishing people. What's driving the upwelling is largely offshore wind and that Coriolis effect again. But for our purposes, the offshore winds are pushing the surface currents offshore, allowing the bottom waters to upwell. And those bottom waters are nutrient rich. I want to talk a little bit about the offshore wind project that's been proposed in Oregon and tie that in with the issue around upwelling. So everybody here, some of you might be familiar with the proposed offshore wind turbine farms off of Oregon. They are proposed for the southern coast, and the reason for the southern coast is that the southern coast of Oregon probably has the strongest, most consistent winds in the whole country. So it's an ideal place to put these wind farms. These wind farms are thought will once completed, will generate enough electricity to light up the whole Oregon coast. So big climatic, boom for Oregon's energy generation.
Yeah, but how much does?
I'll take questions at the end. These things, on the other hand, these things are huge structures, and there are some environmental concerns. Huge cables are going to have to run from these windmills onto shore. They're going to have to dig trenches across beaches, which they'll cover up. There has to be infrastructure on shore. There's issues with migrating birds. There are issues with migrating whales. And I've been following this, and you're doing a good job at addressing all these issues, minimizing the environmental impacts of these structures. Now, there's one issue that I heard about, and this is brought on by the fishing industry, and what they said was that the construction of these windmills will shut down upwelling, and therefore negatively impacting the fishing industry. As an oceanographer, I had an issue with that. It just didn't seem right. This upwelling thing this upwelling occurs because of water, surface water is being pushed offshore, and just intuitively, I couldn't see how that was going to affect the upwelling. And also, the upwelling is a phenomenon that takes place from Alaska all the way down to South America. So I just had trouble envisioning this. And sure enough, last year, there was a paper by a team of physical oceanographers. These guys are oceanographers, but they do a lot of numerical modeling. And they came out with a paper that was presented at the Hatfield Marine Science Center. And the title of the paper was Potential Effects of Large-Scale Floating Offshore Wind Farms on Coastal Upwelling. And what they found was that, if anything, upwelling was going to increase on the ocean side of these windmills. So we can put to rest for now that idea proposed by the fishing industry that somehow upwelling was going to be shut down due to the construction of these wind farms. Okay, let's move closer to shore here. Let's go into the Columbia River Estuary. What is an estuary? It is a partly enclosed body of water where fresh water runoff dilutes ocean water. Some very general characteristics of an estuary. It's an important carbon sink. A lot of carbon is tied up in our estuaries, in the organic matter that accumulates in our estuaries. It's biologically important. for nurseries, feeding grounds for commercially important animals. It efficiently cleanses polluted waters, so the wetlands are notorious for taking up pollutants out of the waters. Absorb water from coastal flooding, so if you have a big storm, the tide goes up. If you have places for that water to overflow, it will save Astoria from being flooded and protect shores from wave erosion. So there's some real benefits that come about due to estuaries. Just real generally, there are 4 types of estuaries. There's a coastal plain estuary. This is in Chesapeake Bay. So during the last glacial period, sea level was a lot lower, and all this land here was dry. Due to the rise in sea level since the last glacial period, we now have estuaries forming on the East Coast. A fjord estuary. A fjord is created by the waxing and waning of an ice sheet, and if that's over the years, over thousands of years, that process has made areas wider, made the inshore areas wider, and as sea level rose since the last glacial period, those inland wide areas have been filled, creating estuaries. We have bar-built estuaries, so if you have a barrier bar offshore, behind that, you can have an estuary form. We have that on the west coast and on the east coast. And finally, a tectonically controlled estuary. The example here is San Francisco Bay. Due to the uplift of this area, the tectonic uplift, the area behind the shoreward areas are now, a lot of the areas are now estuaries. The Columbia River Estuary is largely a tectonically controlled estuary. The geology of the area controls the geometry of our estuary, along with the Army Corps of Engineers. I want to talk a little bit about the hydrography of our estuary. There is variable salinity due to freshwater runoff, due to winds, due to mixing. In general, though, an oceanographer would call the Columbia River Estuary a salt wedge estuary, technically speaking. They would call it that because it's relatively deep, it has a high volume, and there's a strong halocline. And a halocline is that part of the water column where there's a big change in salinity. So high salinity at the top, low salinity at the bottom. That area where that changes is called a halocline. And the little cartoon is showing just that at the mouth, as you go to the mouth of the river, the salinity increases, and sitting on top of the higher salinity values, we have a freshwater lid. Now, what I just presented was a simplified picture of what happens in the estuary. There are seasonal variations in salinity. So during the winter months and the spring months, there's a lot of runoff, making the surface waters relatively fresh, and the bottom waters have higher salinity. Makes sense. During the drier season, when there's more evaporation, the surface waters become enhanced in salt, have higher salinities, and the bottom waters are actually fresher. And then there's times where there's a lot of runoff and a lot of wind, also due to tides. You have a lot of vertical mixing, and our halocline becomes an isohaline. It becomes isohaline, meaning the salinity is about the same throughout the water column. So my point of all this is that there are salinity changes in the Columbia River Estuary, mostly seasonally driven. Tides can cause a salt wedge about 26 miles upstream. So you can see brackish water as far as around 26 miles. And the tidal range in Portland is about 2 to 3 feet. So the tidal effect goes far up the river too. Loss of coastal wetlands is a real issue for a lot of different reasons. It's been thought that half of the U.S. coastal wetlands have been lost due to development. The Office of Wetland Protection was instituted in 1986 with the goal of minimizing wetland loss, and they haven't been doing a too good job. We're losing a lot of wetlands. And it's predicted that as sea level rises, we're going to keep losing wetlands. There's not only unnatural pollution, there's also biologic pollution by non-native species. And this are species that originate elsewhere and are introduced by humans either intentionally or non-intentionally. And these non-native species can outcompete and dominate the native populations. And where I hear about this most is a farm versus indigenous salmon. And perhaps they're outcompeting them. We're talking about salmon that escaped from the farms, and there's issues with breeding. I'll take questions at the end. So there are some real issues with humans introducing non-native species into the estuary. And on our beaches, we have an issue with European versus native beach grasses. So back in the early 1900s, somebody came up with the bright idea of bringing European beach grasses and planting them on our dunes in order to protect houses that are behind the dunes, because the European grasses are more efficient at trapping sand. And sure enough, our dunes are a lot bigger now due to the European grasses. And there are stretches of Oregon that don't have European grasses, and they are a lot lower. But there are some environmental issues with that. One, there are little birds that don't like the European grasses, and they're going extinct. So there's a push now to bring the native species back. Oregon Shores is involved with this project. OSU is involved. And now hybrid species have been discovered, a hybrid between the native and the European grass, and we're not sure what kind of issues the hybrid is going to cause. Want to look a little closer at damage to Columbia River Estuary. We're probably familiar with the fact that dikes, there are plenty of dikes along the estuary. Floodplains have been filled, not good. Dams have, without question, negatively impacted the estuary. But in my mind, and in other people's mind too, the biggest culprit has been the logging industry. And some of the effects of logging is the destruction of stream-side vegetation, which decreases the shade and increases water temperatures. So our fish, the salmon, like cooler waters, and when we clear cut the side tributaries that feed into the river, those tributary waters get warmer. The sun, there's no shade, less shade, so the waters get warmer, and the salmon have a harder time migrating up these streams. Obviously, pesticides, fertilizers, and herbicides are not good for the little creatures. And increased sedimentation has decreased water quality. So what happens here is that before the area is clear cut, you have the trees baffling the rain, so there's not so much erosion of the underlying sediment. You clear cut the area, and all of a sudden there's a lot more mud being washed down into these tributaries and eventually into the river, and the salmon don't like muddy water. The salmon have evolved liking nice, clear, cool waters, not what the logging industry provides. I just include this. There's a great hike that you take. I took this picture from this hike. Anyway, this is a photo of the Salmon River Estuary, and even though back in the 50s and 60s there was pixie land. I won't go into pixie land right now, but there was an amusement park back up in here. But anyway, that's gone, and most of the environmental damage of pixie land has been washed away, and they've made a real concerted effort to leave the Salmon River Estuary, let it return to its natural shape, and they've done a good job. So there are wetlands, there are natural islands forming. The mouth migrates as a natural river should migrate if it wasn't for certain engineers that have to keep the river open. So it's just a pretty picture of a relatively natural estuary. I want to finish up with a little talk about the dams. And I think everybody's probably familiar with the issue with dams, the upriver dams. There's debate going on seems like every month there's some other news coming out about the issue of knocking some dams down. So this is the Ice Harbor Dam on the Snake River. It's one of the dams that are up for knocking down. And there are some real negative impacts of getting rid of these dams. These dams provide clean, renewable energy to numerous towns upriver. With the destruction of the dams, all the grains and potatoes and whatever that is now floated down the river will have to be trucked, increasing pollution, increasing atmospheric CO2. Also, there'll be increased energy use by agriculture. It's a lot more energy efficient to pump water out of a standing body of water that we find behind the dam than it is to pump water out of a flowing body of water. So there's going to be increased energy use by agriculture due to getting rid of these dams. On the other side, the reasons for getting down the dams, the biggest reason I hear is the fish. We want to restore the natural migration paths for the salmon. And I put a question mark there because I want to put a little question in your mind about what I just said. This is the Willapa Bay. Here's Long Beach, here's Astoria. Back in 2018 and 2019, I took on a project with the Washington State Fish and Wildlife, and me, along with 3 students from Cladstock Community College, walked up. We monitored 4 streams that you can't see here, but there are 4 streams right in this area. We monitored those streams for 2 years. Both October and November during spawning season, we would walk up these streams and count salmon. And by the way, these are undammed streams. They're in very natural condition. It was tough going, getting up these streams. There are no paths or anything. It was rough work. So anyway, so for 2 years, 4 of us religiously monitored these streams. And I was told by the ranger that decade or some years ago, he said, you could walk on the backs of salmon going up these streams, tens of thousands of salmon. Over the course of our 2-year study, we counted 1 salmon. What this says to me is, and what it should say to you, is that there's something else going on out there other than dams that are causing the demise of our salmon. And if you talk to most marine biologists, they'll say it's due to the warming of the Pacific Ocean and the decrease in the amount of food. So the message here is we should think carefully about removing these dams. And that's all I have to say. Before taking questions, I want to say, like I said, I'm with Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition. We do all things good along the Oregon coast. We have all sorts of citizen science projects going on, sea stars, marine habitat, water quality studies, beach grass studies. If you have any inclination in getting involved in some good citizen science stuff, I have Jessie Jones sitting back here. She's the Coast Watch Programs Manager for Oregon Shores. And when we're done here, you can go over and chat with her if you're interested in getting involved. That's all I have to say.
So I'm going to come around with a microphone, and if you can just raise your hand, I'll walk over to you, and that way everyone can hear your question.
Explain riptides. They lost a kid off Cannon Beach to riptides.
I'm sorry, I missed your question.
Riptides.
Yeah, what about
Explain
it?
riptides.
What about them?
Explain them. How it causes them.
Yeah, okay. Gee, I wish I had something to draw on. Yeah, the question was, what is a riptide? A riptide is where you have waves coming in to the ocean, that water has to go out. And typically, by the geometry of the bottom, there'll be a conduit. There'll be some sort of a valley, if you will. Probably a better word than that. But there'll be some low point where that water, so the water comes in, goes on the beach, it wants to go out, and there'll be a place that is most conducive for that water to be going out, some sort of channel, and that creates your rip.
What's producing?
Oh, let's hang on one second. I have a woman in the back who wants to ask a question. Thank you.
What the heck is a delta?
What is
Delta.
What is a delta?
Yeah.
Oh, darn, I've got nice pictures of deltas. A delta, but I don't have any with me. The delta is just where a river is dumping a lot of sediment out into the ocean, and as the relatively high energy river, so there's a lot of low energy in that river, dumps out into the ocean, which is in effect low energy. You know, there's not much, I mean, there are waves, but it's essentially a standing body of water. That sediment is dumped. So high energy river, low energy ocean, and the delta takes the form of an apron in front of the river.
And Columbia doesn't have one?
Yeah, it does.
It does?
Except that, again, it's a little screwed. It doesn't look like the Salmon River estuary has the Salmon River has a much more natural looking estuary than the Columbia River, and you can probably guess why. Yes?
This morning I saw a piece of the Bowie Pier building going on its way down the river. And I'm just wondering, it was about over 8 foot long, 2x6 painted white, so there was no doubt where it came from. But I'm wondering how far down the coast that we're gonna have. Along with the labels and cardboard cases and that kind of thing that have come out of there for the last, couple of years.
So you say you found a hunk of wood
I saw it floating down the river.
and it was tied?
From
No.
Bowie Pier.
From the Bowie Beer building. Are you
Oh,
familiar?
no, the building's falling apart.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. So the building's falling
Okay.
apart, some wood got into the river, and you're wondering what's gonna happen to it.
I saw it going down the river, and I'm wondering how far it will get. How
Okay,
far can it get?
a hunk of wood can go far, it floats.
Yeah.
So I really can't say. It's probably gonna head south, and it'll probably bang into some poor surfer down at Seaside. I can't say, you know, it just depends on, if there's a storm going on, if there's a storm taking place right away, it could get washed right up on Fort Stevens
Oh,
Beach. During the summertime, stuff tends to float further offshore, so it might end up in Mexico or Argentina or something.
Well, we've heard of people finding these labels way down on the southern coast.
Yeah.
And they're just pieces of.
Yeah, it depends on the storm, depends on the season, depends on the wind,
Yeah.
just hard to say.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, you mentioned the one day Hugo plate. What's pushing it?
Wow, good question. Where's my whiteboard?
Next time.
Darn. Give me a second here. Yeah, what's driving these plates is something called thermal convection. So, deep in the mantle somewhere, there's a hot spot. A hot spot is just a hot spot within the mantle, and there's plumes of magma rising up, and as it rises up, it cools. So the hot molten magma cools, and as it cools, it starts to spread, and then it moves along, and because it's cool, it descends. So it's essentially a convection cell of heat. And so what's happening here is that the magma is moving up, it reaches the surface, it moves laterally, and it drags the crust with it. So that's what's dragging the Juan de Fuca plate.
So that's like the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Because the
Well,
water is, it's
the
coming up.
the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, there's new crustal material being formed.
That's not right there?
No, no, all we're having here is, yeah, I shouldn't say no, there are smokers, yeah, there is some volcanic activity, but nothing like the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Most of the energy is being focused laterally and dragging that plate along with it. So I shouldn't say that there's no volcanic activity along this stretch of real estate here. There is some, but nothing like the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And once again, most of the energy is being put into lateral, most of the energy is lateral energy having the effect of dragging the plate.
Okay.
Good question.
The second question I had, you had mentioned the wind project off the coast. You had also mentioned you had studied the updwelling. And you had mentioned that the updwelling, they said, would increase on the ocean side of the new wind. But if you decrease the updwelling on the coastal side, that's going to decrease the fishing capability. There's not much.
So
in
if
the
you're a
open
fisherman,
ocean.
drive around to the front side where.
No, this thing is, from my understanding, it's supposed to be 30 or 40 miles off the coast.
Correct.
Most people don't fish in deep water. There's no fish out there.
When I say in front of the turbine and in back of the turbine, I'm talking very proximal. So you go a couple miles in and it'll resume to normal.
Oh, okay.
So it's not going to shut down all upwelling in a big swath of real estate behind that windmill. Just immediately proximal, there'll be increase and a little decrease.
Okay, that explains it. Thank you.
Like I said, if you're a fishing person,
No, it's fine.
if you're a fishing person and you're getting less fish on the landward side, drive your boat to the other side where fishing will be enhanced. Also, these windmills are going to turn into, over years, giant reefs where there's going to be probably more fishing activity. Yeah, well, that's what they're saying.
But that's deep water there, right?
Yeah, that's true.
You're talking 2 to 3 miles deep without.
Well, yeah, I'm just talking about the photic zone, where light is. There's going to be enhanced biologic activity around those cables.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what they're proposing, that's in their proposal.
One that was just quick. You mentioned the California current. Is that the same as the Japanese current, or are they two separate currents?
They're both part of the same gyre.
Oh, okay.
One's the eastern side, the other is the western side.
Okay.
This really isn't a question, but more of a statement about salmon farming. The problem with salmon farming is not escape Atlantics. These have been in Northwest waters for about 40 years, since the 80s. The problem is the pollution that they give off and the sea lice that they breed in mats. So every time you want to buy farm salmon, think of that.
Thanks for saying that. I know very little about salmon
I'm more
farming.
on the fishery side of this than your side. I still find that fascinating.
Thanks, I appreciate that. Yes,
So we were here a few weeks ago for about dredging the Columbia River and where they dump the sand. And so you talked about all the erosion happening along Fort Stevens. When they're dumping the dredged sand out there, I mean, has that made any difference at all in the erosion of the beach at Fort Stevens?
if it has, it's really minimal because there's big tiny erosion going on. So perhaps it has slowed erosion down, so maybe it would even be worse if it wasn't for the dumping of that dredge. I don't know, I can't answer that. That's a good point though.
You were saying that there's a whole new ecosystem with the plastic island. So are the fish and other crustacean, whatever, are they acclimating themselves to live on plastic and become a new species?
Yes, this finding is pretty new. And in the next couple of years, there's probably going to be all kinds of studies on the new ecology of living on plastic. But that's what it seems to. They're using the floating plastics as islands, as little platforms to live and breed on.
But they're not dying.
No, they're very happy. Yeah, and that's what I say, that's a conundrum. Should we be out there cleaning this plastic up when you're gonna kill so much biological life? I don't know what's gonna happen.
So should we start being able to acclimate ourselves to living on plastic?
From what I hear, we already are.
Well, that's what I'm getting at, is that oil industry would love to hear that.
Right.
You were saying that there's negative effects from the dikes or the, jetties, excuse me, yes. And then the seawalls and, you're freaking me out. And those upper walls that they put out farther, what would be the answer to take them down though? What would happen if they weren't there, if the jetties weren't there and the seawalls and?
Good question. So in my example of what was going on in Maryland there, if you took down the seawalls, the beach would straighten out, and over time it would re-equilibrate, and according to the people who study this more than I do, the beach would actually either stabilize or grow some. Those hard structures increase, over the long run, increase erosion. So if you had knocked down the breakwater offshore of Long Beach, California, you couldn't have your harbor there anymore, but the beach would straighten out. So, did that answer your question?
Yeah, I was just curious what would happen if we didn't have our jetties.
The Columbia River would shift like it has done over geologic time. The river hasn't always been here. It's held here by the Army Corps of Engineering. If we knock those jetties down, the river would shift. It's just a natural tendency of rivers and mouths of rivers to migrate.
All right, we're gonna do one more question.
This is a strange one. A friend of ours, you know where Rhodes Inn is near Lincoln City? Rhodes Inn. Well, it's about 50 feet up off the beach. He bought a property in '59. Because he was eroding his bank, so he got big permits, put Volkswagen-size boulders in and planted it. And he's now on a peninsula, kind of. But the houses next to him, the people who wouldn't spend the money to put the riprap in, are now having to move their houses because the bank's going. What can he expect?
What can he do?
No, expect what? Because his looks perfect now, but you say when you build a wall, it has negative effects.
Yeah. Well, like you just said, his neighbors have to move. So that's a negative effect. And with time, what's happening to neighbors will impact him. Without question, he can't be an island.
Right.
Those waters are going to wrap around and erode. So in time, he's going to lose. It's a no-win battle. You can just keep pouring money into it all you want, and eventually you're going to lose.
Also, it's private island.
All right, let's give Dr. Ed Joyce a round of applause. Thank
I appreciate your attention. I appreciate the good questions. Good audience.
And we will have another speaker back here in April, on Tuesday, April 30th at 11. Jamie Kish is going to be coming from the Cape Perpetua Tide Pool Collective. Some of you may remember she was supposed to come for our Past to Present series, but she'll be coming to us instead on April 30th. So we hope to see you then.
Quick question right here.